a strong, prosperous Europe is a good thing for America.
Now, Ukraine cannot be on the table, but at the table in the negotiations to end the war with Russia. That's what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told world leaders at the Munich Security Conference earlier this morning.
Ukraine will never accept deals made behind our backs without our involvement. And the same rule should apply to all of Europe. No decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine, no decisions about Europe without Europe. Anything else is zero.
President Zelensky also went on to say that he would not give up on NATO membership for Ukraine, which Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been backing this week, and expressed his doubt that Russian President Vladimir Putin actually wants peace in Ukraine. Zelensky and US Vice President J.D. Vance met on the sidelines of the security conference yesterday to discuss Ukraine's conditions ahead of a possible peace talks with Putin. Well, joining us now with his thoughts is retired diplomat and former chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee and crossbench peer, Peter Ricketts. Lord Ricketts, welcome to the show. Thank you for giving us your time.
Hello, Alexis.
What did you make of Zelensky's speech in Munich today, Lord Ricketts, particularly his plea for Europe to put together a European army?
Well, first of all, I think it's entirely reasonable for Zelensky to say there can't be a deal about Ukraine's future without Ukraine at the table. It's Ukrainian people who've been fighting and dying for 3 years against this Russian aggression, and they deserve to be a full part of the negotiation and whatever ceasefire deal can be found. And I understand his frustration that there isn't a European set of armed forces without the Americans that could be deployed to Ukraine. But this idea of a European army has been around for 50 years, and in the end, it's never worked. I don't think any country, certainly not a major military country like the UK or France, actually would put their forces under some general European command. But I think Europeans working together to spend our defense pounds more effectively together, that absolutely is necessary after the cold shower we've all had from the American position taken in the last few days.
So do you think that there is going to be a move towards making that 15-year-old idea a reality? I mean, I'm looking at Viktor Orban, who's been speaking to the papers in Hungary. He said that the risk of what's going on in Ukraine, it risks becoming the EU's Afghanistan, as he put it. This idea that this is going to be a never-ending war. And for having a EU army, you're going to need all the heads of state within the EU to come together. That's going to be impossible, isn't it?
Yeah, Alexis, I think we should just put aside this idea of an EU army. It's never going to happen. No country like the UK or France would put its armed forces under the command of some sort of broad European headquarters. Remember, even NATO, there isn't a NATO army. The UK contributes forces to NATO, but they stay under British command, and it would be Britain who take the final decisions about how they're used. So I think it's much more sensible to talk about European cooperation. And anyway, Orban is the last person who can really lecture us about Europe doing more together. He's been a Russian supporter all the way through and be very disruptive of all European efforts. So I think the way to think about this is the Europeans need to work better together in terms of producing weapons, the defense industry, in terms of working together operationally in the armed forces, so that we can at least do something if the Americans decide to block Ukraine from NATO and we have to provide some sort of security guarantee on the ground in Ukraine after a peace settlement.
Is there a way for Europe, perhaps with the assistance of the UK, to give those guarantees without American support? I mean, that is the question that we're going to be asking later on in the show. You know, can NATO survive without US support? I mean, with the rhetoric we're seeing coming from the Trump administration, the fact that they're saying, look, it's time for Europe to be able to pay its own bills and look after itself, is that realistic at the moment?
I mean, let's distinguish two things. I don't think that Trump or any of his people are talking about the US leaving NATO. They seem to have accepted that NATO is useful. That's what Defense Secretary Hesketh said in Brussels a couple of days ago. But equally, they are not going to be involved with American forces, with American arms deliveries to Ukraine post the ceasefire. That's the message they've been sending. I mean, to be honest, NATO is nothing if the Americans aren't part of it. NATO was a bargain made in 1949 between the West Europeans and the US, who decided that the North Atlantic area was something that all sides wanted to defend. Without the US, then we're just back to the Europeans doing the best they can. But I do think that it is possible for the Europeans to do something, to get some forces into Ukraine. I don't actually like this term peacekeeping forces. It's not as if European forces are going to stand between the Russians and the Ukrainians to keep them apart and stop them coming to a further round of fighting. It's more to be in Ukraine, to give support to Ukraine. And I don't think you need vast numbers to do that, but you would need the Europeans to work effectively together. So let's try to preserve NATO as the ultimate deterrent against the security, the sovereignty of our countries, where I think the US are still committed. And let's accept that the Americans are not going to do that much on Ukraine, and the Europeans are going to have to take more of the burden for that, which means spending quite a lot more on defense. And I don't yet hear a clear commitment on that from British ministers.
But Lord Ricketts, you just said that NATO would be nothing without the US support. But can you see this US administration, the Trump administration, stepping in to help a NATO country fend off an aggressor if it was to happen, say, elsewhere than we've seen in Ukraine? The rhetoric that's coming out of the US, and I believe it was one of Donald Trump's speeches before he was elected president, if you don't pay your full share of NATO, then we're not going to come to your rescue. Do you think that Trump would come to a country's rescue to fend off an aggressor?
I mean, I have no sort of secret way of looking into Trump's mind. Since he's been president, he hasn't said anything like that. And I go back to what his new defense secretary said in Brussels. He said explicitly that the US regards NATO as a useful, valuable thing and is fully committed to it. What they're not committed to is NATO taking on a peacekeeping role in Ukraine, which is outside the NATO area. So unless we are told otherwise, I think it's fair enough that the 80-year commitment that America has made to stand behind European security, to extend its nuclear protective umbrella over Europe, that is still in place. I mean, if Trump wants to tell us it's not, well, then we're in a very different world. We need to draw the consequences. But as of now, the Americans are saying they are still allies in NATO, and therefore, yes, they take on the commitment to come to the support of a NATO country which was under armed attack.
Looking at the negotiations that are, about to commence, as we've been given to understand, between Russia and Ukraine, what did you make of that phone call that you heard about, that 90-minute phone call on Wednesday that President Trump had before speaking to President Zelensky with Vladimir Putin and his defense secretary, basically putting on the table the two things that Vladimir Putin had said were, deal breakers. He wanted to keep hold of the territory he's already got now, and a cast iron guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. It feels like an odd way to start a negotiation by giving one party exactly what they've been asking for all along.
Well, I agree. I mean, what Hesketh said in Brussels gave away a number of the key negotiating cards that Ukraine would have wanted to play in the negotiation. The issue of are they going to get back the territory to their 2014 borders? Americans are saying no. Can they join NATO? The Americans are saying no. Are Americans going to continue to give major support to Ukraine? Americans are saying no, it'll have to be Europeans. So that is some major bargaining cards given away. I mean, to answer your question about the 90-minute phone call, that leaves me pretty worried, to be honest, because we've got two people there. One is a highly manipulative, cynical guy in Putin who knows every corner of this issue, and the other, Donald Trump, whose grip on the detail is perhaps fairly modest, who may have given away all kinds of things without actually realizing it in a 90-minute phone call with a former KGB spy who is an expert manipulator and seducer, recruiter. So that leaves me worried. And the fact that the Americans have started this negotiation really by chasing after the Russians and at the same time telling the Ukrainians they can't have a lot of what they have been as I said, fighting and dying for in the last 3 years, that's not a great start. However, we're only at the start. This is going to run for quite a time. I hope the European leaders can get in amongst the Americans and make clear that, yes, Donald Trump likes to be somebody who makes peace, ends wars, but equally he likes to be somebody who's seen as strong. And the way to see it strong is to come out of a negotiation with Ukraine still as an independent, sovereign country with its own rights, and the Russians having to accept some compromises to get to a ceasefire. So I don't think we should give up on that yet, but the first few days have certainly given a lot of cause to worry all around European capitals.
Final question, Lord Ricketts. We are being given to understand that Keir Starmer is going to be flying to Washington to meet with President Trump. What do you think should be on top of Keir Starmer's agenda?
Well, I think this issue should be on top of it. There's nothing more important for European security than how this war in Ukraine ends and how America intends to continue working with its European allies. And I think there's still a lot to be played for there, as we've been discussing. I mean, America has stood behind European security for 2 generations. And it's important, I think, that Keir Starmer brings Trump to understand that a strong, prosperous Europe is a good thing for America because we take a lot of American trade, a lot of American interests engaged here. I'm sure that Starmer will also want to talk about the issue of tariffs and try to make sure that they don't apply to British exports to the US. But the first thing of all is the security of the country, and that's got to be on top of his agenda. I hope that Starmer can take with him an undertaking that the UK will significantly raise its defence spending, because that will be the most effective thing to do for Trump to show that we are taking more of the strain of the security of our continent.